The first time he looked at me, I realized silence could be louder than screaming. The mirror in the employee restroom was cracked along the corner, splitting my reflection into uneven pieces that didn't quite line up. And maybe that was fitting because nothing about me felt whole anymore. Not the way my hands trembled as I applied foundation, a shade too warm for my skin. Not the way I tugged my sleeves down over my wrists, even though the late August heat pressed against the windows like a living thing. 92 degrees outside, and I was dressed for winter because covering up had become instinct, like breathing, like pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. And I had gotten very good at pretending, good enough that most people didn't look twice, good enough that I could carry trays of champagne through rooms filled with people who had never once worried about rent or survival and smile like I belonged there, even when I didn't, especially when I didn't, because belonging was an illusion you learned to perform when you had no other choice, and tonight was no different. The restaurant glowing in soft amber light, polished marble floors reflecting crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than I made in a year, the kind of place where deals were made in low voices and power didn't need to announce itself. It just existed, heavy and undeniable, and I moved through it like a ghost, unseen, unheard, exactly how I preferred it, until the air changed, subtle at first, like the moment before a storm rolls in. Conversations lowering just slightly, movement shifting, attention redirecting toward the entrance without anyone saying a word, and I felt it before I saw him. That strange pull, like my instincts were trying to warn me about something I couldn't yet name, and when I finally looked up, my breath caught in a way I couldn't explain, because he didn't just walk into the room, he owned it, every step measured, controlled, his presence quiet but absolute. The kind of authority that didn't need volume to be felt. Dark suit tailored to perfection, shoulders squared, eyes scanning the space like he was cataloging everything and everyone in it. And when those eyes found me, it felt like the ground shifted beneath my feet, not because of fear exactly, but because of recognition, like he saw something I had worked very hard to hide. And I looked away too quickly, focusing on the tray in my hands, counting the glasses, steadying my breathing, telling myself it didn't matter, that he was just another powerful man passing through a world I served but didn't belong to. And yet, minutes later, I felt him again, closer this time, his presence unmistakable, even without looking, and I told myself to stay calm, to keep moving, to be invisible. But invisibility has a way of failing at the worst possible moments, because as I turned, my elbow caught the edge of a chair, the tray tilting just enough to send a glass sliding. My heart jumping into my throat as I reached to steady it, already imagining the sound of shattering crystal, the manager's sharp voice, the cost I couldn't afford. But it never hit the ground, because a hand closed around my wrist. Firm, precise, stopping the movement entirely, and everything froze, my breath, my thoughts, the noise around us fading into something distant and irrelevant, and I didn't need to look to know it was him, the man from the entrance. The one who had shifted the entire room without saying a word, and his grip wasn't rough, not even close, but it was impossible to ignore, controlled strength wrapped in quiet intention, and for a second, just 1 second, I forgot to pull away, forgot to pretend, forgot everything except the way his fingers rested against my skin, and then I realized what had happened. My sleeve pushed back just enough to reveal what I had been hiding all night, what I always hid, and my stomach dropped, panic rushing in too fast, too sharp, as I yanked my arm back, tugging the fabric down like it could erase what he'd already seen. "I'm fine," I said too quickly, the words automatic, rehearsed, my voice steadier than I felt, because that was the rule, always the rule. Deny, deflect, move on. But he didn't move, didn't speak, didn't look away, and when I finally forced myself to meet his gaze, I understood something I hadn't expected, something far more dangerous than being seen. He didn't believe me, not even a little, and worse, he wasn't going to forget. I told myself to forget him the second he let go of my wrist. But forgetting someone like that was not as simple as walking away, because even after I disappeared back into the rhythm of the restaurant, balancing trays and forcing polite smiles, I could still feel it, that brief moment replaying in my mind like something unfinished, like a question that had been asked without words and refused to fade. And no matter how carefully I moved, no matter how much I focused on being invisible again, I Knew he was still there, somewhere behind me, watching in a way that made my skin feel too tight, like I was being seen from the inside out. And I hated that feeling more than anything, because being seen meant being exposed, and exposure was something I had spent months learning to avoid. So I kept my head down, kept moving, kept pretending that everything was normal, even when it was not. Even when my hands shook just slightly as I set down a glass of water at table 14 and nearly missed the coaster entirely, earning a quick glance from the manager that I pretended not to notice. Because attention was dangerous, attention led to questions, and questions led to things I could not afford to answer. But the night stretched on, and the tension never eased. It only shifted, growing quieter, heavier, like something waiting just beneath the surface. And when I finally made my way into the back hallway near the service entrance, I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, pressing my palms against the cool tile wall as I tried to steady myself, telling myself that it was almost over, that I just needed to get through the next hour, collect my tips, and go home. Because home, no matter how small or imperfect, was still predictable, still something I understood, and predictability was the closest thing I had to safety. But even as I thought it, something in my chest tightened, a quiet warning I could not ignore, and I pushed it aside the way I always did, because thinking too much only made everything worse. And that was when I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, not rushed, not uncertain, the kind of steps that belonged to someone who never had to hurry, and I did not need to turn around to know who it was. My body already reacting before my mind caught up, shoulders tensing, breath catching. Every instinct telling me to leave, to walk away, to not engage. But my feet stayed where they were, like they had forgotten how to move. And when his voice came, low and controlled, it did not startle me. It settled over me, heavy and undeniable. You are not. Fine, he said, not a question, not even an accusation, just a statement, calm and certain in a way that made it impossible to dismiss. And I forced a small laugh that sounded wrong even to my own ears, shaking my head as I turned just enough to face him without fully meeting his gaze. It was nothing, I said, keeping my tone light, casual, the same way I had practiced in front of mirrors and empty rooms. Because if I sounded convincing enough, maybe it would become true. Maybe he would let it go. Maybe this would end right here. But he did not move, did not speak again immediately, and the silence stretched between us in a way that felt intentional, like he was giving me time to continue lying, time to dig myself deeper if I chose to. And when I finally looked up, I saw it. Not anger, not pity, something else entirely, something sharper, more focused, like he was putting together pieces of a puzzle I had not realized were scattered so clearly in front of him. And that realization sent a flicker of panic through me that I struggled to hide, because I did not know what he would do with that information, did not know why he cared at all. And people like him did not notice people like me without a reason, and reasons like that never ended simply. Who is he? He asked quietly, and the question hit harder than it should have, not because of what it implied, but because of how easily he had reached the truth without me saying a word. And I shook my head again, faster this time, stepping back just slightly, putting space between us like distance could protect me. You are mistaken, I said, the words coming out softer now, less certain. And for a moment, neither of us moved, the hallway too quiet, the world outside continuing as if nothing had shifted, as if everything had not just changed in a way I could not yet understand. And then he nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement, like he had expected that answer all along. Like this conversation was only the beginning of something much larger, something already in motion. And when he turned to leave, his voice came one last time, calm, final. I do not like lies, he said. And then he was gone, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before, and the unsettling certainty that whatever I had just tried to hide was no longer mine to control. I should have left it there, should have finished my shift, taken my tips, and gone home like nothing had changed. But the moment he walked away, something inside me refused to settle, like a thread had been pulled loose, and I could not push it back into place. And no matter how hard I tried to focus on the rest of the night, on orders and tables, and the steady rhythm of work, my mind kept circling back to the way he had said it, calm and certain, like he already knew the answer and was only waiting for me to admit it. And that terrified me more than anything, because secrets only stay safe when no one is looking for them. And now someone was, someone who did not seem like the type to stop halfway. So I rushed through the rest of my shift, moving faster than usual, avoiding eye contact, ignoring the quiet whispers from other staff about the man in the private section. The one everyone seemed to recognize, but no one dared to speak about too loudly. And by the time I finally stepped out into the parking lot just after midnight, the air cooler now, but still thick with the heat of the day, I felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with work, my body heavy, my thoughts louder than the distant hum of traffic, and all I wanted was to get into my car and disappear into something familiar, something predictable. But predictability had already started to slip through my fingers, because as I reached for my keys, I noticed the car parked 2 spaces over. Dark, polished, out of place in a lot filled with aging sedans and compact cars, and I knew before I even turned fully toward it that it belonged to him. The same quiet certainty settling over me again, and for a moment I considered turning around, going back inside, pretending I had forgotten something, anything to avoid whatever came next, but I did not move, because running only delayed things, it never stopped them, and I was so tired of delaying, so I kept walking, slow, careful steps, toward my own car, pretending I had not noticed, pretending everything was still normal, until the driver's side door of the black car opened, and he stepped out, smooth, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world, and my breath caught despite myself, my hand tightening around my keys as I forced myself to keep moving, not stopping, not acknowledging him, because acknowledgement meant engagement, and engagement meant losing control of the situation, but he did not call out, did not rush forward. He simply matched my pace, closing the distance between us without urgency, and when he spoke, it was quiet enough that it did not carry beyond the space between us. "You should not be alone out here," he said, and I almost laughed at the irony of it. The way concern sounded so natural coming from someone I did not know, someone I had every reason to be wary of, and I shook my head, unlocking my car with a quick press of the button. "I do this every night," I replied, my voice steady. Even as my pulse quickened, "I am fine." The same words again, the same lie, repeated out of habit more than belief, and for a second I thought he might let it go, might accept the distance I was trying to create. But instead he stepped closer, not enough to crowd me, just enough to make it impossible to ignore his presence, and when I turned to face him fully, there was something different in his expression now, less observation, more decision, like he had already crossed a line in his mind that I had not seen. "You say that like it is true," he said, his voice still calm, still controlled. "But your hands tell a different story." And I followed his gaze before I could stop myself, noticing the slight tremor in my fingers, the way I was gripping my keys too tightly, and embarrassment flared, sharp and unwelcome, because I had worked so hard to hide that, to control every small detail, and now it was all visible in ways I could not fix, and I pulled my hand back instinctively, curling my fingers into my palm. "It is just a long day," I said, softer now, less convincing even to myself. And he watched me for a moment longer, silent again, that same deliberate silence that made me feel like he was waiting for something deeper, something I was not ready to give. And then he reached into his jacket, pulling out a small card, holding it between 2 fingers before offering it to me, not forcing, just presenting, and I hesitated before taking it, the paper heavier than it should have been, his name printed in clean, simple letters, a phone number beneath it. Nothing more, no explanation, no pressure, just a quiet expectation that I would understand. "If you need something," he said, and there was a pause there, brief but intentional, like the word something carried more meaning than it should have. "Call." And I looked up at him, searching for something in his expression, some hint of motive, of reason, but all I found was that same steady certainty, and it unsettled me in a way I could not explain, because part of me wanted to refuse, to reject whatever this was before it could grow into something complicated, something dangerous, but another part of me, quieter but harder to ignore, recognized the offer for what it was, not control, not yet, but protection, and protection was something I had not felt in a very long time, and that realization stayed with me long after he stepped back, giving me space again, long after I got into my car and closed the door, the card still clutched in my hand, long after I started the engine and drove away, because for the first time in months, The silence I had been living in no longer felt like it belonged only to me. The drive home felt longer than usual, even though every streetlight turned green like the city was trying to rush me forward, and I kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting in my lap, fingers curled tightly around the card he had given me, the edges pressing into my skin like a quiet reminder that tonight had not been a coincidence, that something had shifted whether I wanted it to or not, and I told myself it meant nothing, that people like him did not involve themselves in lives like mine without a reason, and reasons like that never came without a cost. So by the time I pulled into the narrow parking space outside my building, I had already decided to forget it, to tuck the card away, and move on, because moving on was what I did best. It was how I survived. But survival has a way of feeling fragile when you know someone else has seen through it. And as I climbed the worn steps to my apartment, each creak of the wood too loud in the quiet hallway, I felt that fragility settling in again, heavy and familiar, the kind that sat in your chest and refused to leave. And when I reached my door, I paused for a second longer than usual, listening, the habit automatic now, checking for silence before I stepped inside. And when I finally opened it, the dim light from the lamp in the corner greeted me, unchanged, predictable, almost comforting in its stillness, and I exhaled slowly, closing the door behind me with care, setting my bag down by the couch, telling myself again that everything was fine, that tonight had just been a long shift, nothing more, nothing less. But then I saw him, sitting at the small kitchen table like he had been waiting for hours, and every thought in my head stopped at once, my breath catching so sharply it hurt, because he was not supposed to be there, not yet, not tonight, and the space that had felt safe a moment ago suddenly felt too small, too quiet, like the walls had closed in without warning, and I forced my expression to remain neutral, to not show the flicker of unease that rose too quickly, because showing anything only made things worse. "You are late," he said, his tone calm, but edged with something I knew better than to challenge, and I stepped further inside, closing the distance slowly, controlled, setting my keys on the counter with deliberate care so my hands would not betray me. "Work ran long," I replied, keeping my voice even, steady, the way I had practiced, the way I always did, and his gaze followed every movement, not missing anything, not the slight tension in my shoulders, not the way I avoided looking directly at him. And for a moment, the room settled into a silence that felt too loud, like something waiting to break, and I could feel it building, that familiar pressure, the one I had learned to navigate carefully, choosing every word, every breath, because the wrong move could shift everything in ways I could not control, and I hated that feeling, hated how small it made me, how predictable my world had become, and yet, tonight, something was different, not in him, not in the room, but in me, because as I stood there, the card still hidden in my hand, I realized that the silence I had been living with no longer felt the same. It felt thinner, more fragile, like it could be broken if I pushed too hard, and that thought lingered, unsettling and new, as he leaned back, slightly in his chair, studying me with a look I could not fully read. "You seem distracted," he said, and I shook my head immediately, the response automatic. "I am just tired," I answered, softer now, careful, measured, and for a second, I thought that would be enough, that the moment would pass like so many others before it, but then his eyes dropped briefly, just long enough to notice the way my fingers tightened around something unseen, and when his gaze lifted again, there was a question. There, unspoken but unmistakable, and my pulse quickened despite my effort to stay calm, because I knew what came next. I knew how this played out, the slow unraveling of things I tried to keep hidden, and for the first time, the card in my hand did not feel like a mistake. It felt like a choice, one I had not yet made, one that suddenly mattered more than anything else in the room, and as the silence stretched between us again, I understood something I had been avoiding all night. This was not just about being seen anymore. It was about what I would do now that I had been. I did not answer right away, because answering meant choosing, and choosing meant accepting that something had already changed, and I was not ready to admit that out loud, not to him, not even to myself. So instead I moved past him, slow and careful, placing my bag on the counter, giving myself something to do, something normal, because normal was safe and I needed safe more than anything. But the air in the apartment did not feel normal anymore. It felt charged, like every movement mattered more than it should, like he was watching not just what I did, but what I might do next, and that kind of attention was suffocating in a way I could not explain. "You should have called," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, but still firm, and I paused, my back to him, fingers resting against the edge of the sink as I tried to steady the sudden rush of thoughts, because that sentence carried more weight than it seemed. It was not concern, not really. It was expectation, control wrapped in something that sounded almost reasonable, and I had spent too long learning how to recognize the difference. So I took a slow breath before turning around, keeping my expression neutral, my tone calm. "My phone died," I said. Another lie. Easier than the truth. Easier than explaining why I had not wanted to call anyone at all. And for a second, the room fell quiet again, that heavy silence pressing in from all sides. And when I looked at him, I saw it. Not anger, not yet, but something sharper, like he was measuring the distance between what I said and what he believed, and that distance had never worked in my favor. "You forget things lately," he continued, standing now, slow and deliberate, the scrape of the chair against the floor louder than it should have been, and I felt my shoulders tense despite myself, my body reacting before my mind could catch up, because this was familiar, too familiar, the shift in tone, the narrowing of space, the way the room seemed to shrink around us, and I hated how predictable it all felt, how easy it was to fall back into the same pattern, the same quiet compliance that kept everything from escalating. So I nodded slightly, keeping my voice soft. "I have just been working a lot," I replied, and I could hear it even as I said it, the careful balance, not too defensive, not too distant, just enough to keep things steady. But tonight, something inside me resisted, something small but stubborn that refused to settle completely, and I realized it was because of the cards still in my hand, hidden but present, a reminder that there was something outside of this room, something I had not considered before, and that realization shifted something in me in a way I could not ignore. Because for the first time, the words I was saying felt like a choice instead of a reflex, and that scared me more than anything else, because choices meant consequences, and consequences were unpredictable, and unpredictability had never been safe. "Show me your hand," he said suddenly, the request cutting through my thoughts, simple, direct, and I froze for half a second. Just enough to notice. Just enough for him to notice too. And I knew then that refusing would only make things worse. That hesitation had already said more than words ever could. So I stepped forward, slowly, extending my hand with deliberate control, forcing my fingers to stay still even though I could feel the tension running through them. And his gaze dropped immediately, focusing on the small details I had hoped would go unnoticed, the faint marks, the slight tremor, the way I was holding myself too carefully. And for a moment, he said nothing, and that silence felt heavier than any words, because it meant he was thinking, calculating, deciding, and I stood there, waiting my breath. Shallow, my thoughts louder than the quiet around us, until finally he looked up again, and whatever he saw in my expression must have shifted something, because his voice, when it came, was different, softer but no less controlled. "You need to be more careful," he said. And I almost laughed at the irony, at the simplicity of that statement compared to everything it ignored, everything it refused to acknowledge. But I did not laugh. I just nodded again, because that was easier, because that was what kept things steady. And yet, as I pulled my hand back, curling my fingers around the card once more, I felt it clearly for the first time, that quiet, undeniable truth settling in beneath everything else. Careful was no longer enough. And whatever came next, it was not something I could keep pretending did not exist. Sleep did not come easy that night, not because of him sitting across from me at the table, not because of the quiet tension that lingered in every corner of the apartment, but because something inside me had already started to shift in a way I could not reverse. And even after the lights were off and the room settled into darkness, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the cards still hidden beneath my pillow like a secret I had not decided what to do with, and I kept replaying everything. The way Adrian had looked at me, the way he had said nothing but still understood too much, the way his voice carried certainty instead of doubt, and it made my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear alone, because fear I understood, fear was predictable, it had rules, it had patterns, but this was different. This was something unfamiliar, something that felt like possibility. And possibility was dangerous in a way I had never allowed myself to consider. Because it meant there could be something beyond this, something outside the narrow space I had been living in, and thinking like that only made everything harder. So I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe slower, deeper, trying to quiet the noise in my head until eventually exhaustion took over, pulling me into a restless sleep that felt more like waiting than resting. And when morning came, it arrived too quickly. Sunlight slipping through the thin curtains, casting pale lines across the walls. And for a moment, just one moment, everything felt normal again, like nothing had changed, like last night had been nothing more than a long shift and a strange encounter that meant nothing. But then I moved, shifting slightly against the pillow, and felt it, the card still there, solid and real, and the illusion of normal disappeared just as quickly as it had come, replaced by that same quiet awareness that things were no longer the same. And I sat up slowly, careful not to make too much noise, glancing toward the other room, listening for movement, for any sign that the morning would follow the same pattern it always did. And when I heard nothing, I allowed myself a small breath of relief, sliding out of bed and moving toward the bathroom, my reflection catching me off guard again. The same face, the same careful expression, but something in my eyes had changed, something subtle but undeniable, like I had seen something I could not unsee, and I reached up, brushing my fingers lightly against my wrist before pulling my sleeve down again out of habit, even though there was no one watching, because habits like that did not disappear overnight. They stayed, ingrained and automatic. But as I turned away from the mirror, my gaze flickered toward the bedroom for just a second longer than necessary, toward the place where the card still waited, and I felt it again, that quiet pull, that choice I had been avoiding, growing louder, harder to ignore, and I knew that if I picked it up, if I even looked at it too closely, I would not be able to pretend anymore. I would have to decide what it meant, what I wanted it to mean, and that decision felt heavier than anything else in the room, heavier than the silence, heavier than the routine I had built so carefully, because routine kept me safe, but it also kept me here, exactly where I had been, and for the first time, I was not sure that was enough, not after everything that had happened, not after the way someone had looked at me and seen more than I was willing to show. And as I stood there, caught between what I knew and what I could not yet understand, one thought settled in clearly, steady and impossible to ignore. If I kept pretending, nothing would change, but if I stopped, everything might. The card stayed where I left it for exactly 12 minutes. And I know that because I kept checking the clock like time could make the decision for me. Like if I waited long enough it would stop matching, but it did not. It only grew louder in my mind, heavier in the room, until ignoring it felt harder than facing it. And I hated that. Hated how something so small could carry that much weight. But that was the truth I could not avoid anymore. So I walked back into the bedroom slowly, each step deliberate, like I was approaching something fragile that might break if I moved too quickly. And when I reached the bed, I did not hesitate this time. I reached under the pillow and pulled the card out, holding it between my fingers as I stared at it. The clean lines, the simple name, the number beneath it, nothing dramatic, nothing threatening, just an option. And that was what made it so difficult, because options meant responsibility, and responsibility meant I could no longer pretend I had no control over what happened next. And for a moment, I just stood there, the silence pressing in around me, until I finally exhaled slowly and reached for my phone, my hand steady in a way that surprised me, because I expected fear, expected hesitation, but what I felt instead was something quieter, something more certain, like a decision that had already been made before I even realized it. And before I could second-guess myself, I dialed the number, pressing the phone to my ear as the line rang once, twice, and then stopped, replaced by his voice, low and controlled, exactly the same as I remembered. Yes, he said, not hello, not a question, just acknowledgement, like he had been expecting this, like there was no doubt in his mind that I would call, and that unsettled me more than anything else, because I had spent the entire night convincing myself I would not, and yet here I was, proving him right without him even needing to ask. It is me, I said, my voice quieter than I intended, but still steady, still controlled, and there was a brief pause on the other end, not confusion, not surprise, something else, like confirmation, and then, I know, he replied, and the simplicity of that answer sent a small, unexpected chill through me. Because of course he knew. Of course he had recognized my voice. Or maybe he had never needed to. Maybe he had already decided this would happen, and I found myself gripping the phone a little tighter as I forced my thoughts back into order. I do not know why I called. I admitted, the truth slipping out before I could stop it, because pretending felt pointless now. Not with him, not after everything, and for a second, there was silence again. That same deliberate quiet he used like space, like he was giving me room to hear my own words, to understand what I had just said. And when he spoke again, his voice was softer, but no less certain. You called because you are tired of pretending, he said, and I closed my eyes briefly, the accuracy of it hitting deeper than I expected, because that was exactly it. Not fear, not desperation, just exhaustion from carrying something I was no longer sure I wanted to carry alone. And I let out a slow breath, leaning back slightly against the edge of the bed as I tried to find the right words, but none of them felt right. None of them felt enough, and that silence stretched again, but this time it was different, less heavy, less suffocating, like something had shifted without me fully understanding how. What happens now? I asked finally, the question quiet but real, because this was the part one could not see, the part one had no control over, and that uncertainty settled in my chest in a way that felt both terrifying and strangely calm. And on the other end of the line, there was no hesitation, no pause, just that same steady certainty I had come to recognize. Now, he said, his voice low and measured, you stop being alone in it. And I sat there, the phone pressed to my ear, the room around me unchanged and yet completely different, because for the first time in a long time, the silence I had been living in did not feel like something I had to survive. It felt like something that might finally break. I did not realize how much that sentence would change everything until I ended the call and the room fell silent again. But it was not the same silence anymore. It was not heavy or suffocating. It was something else entirely, something that felt like space, like a door I had not known existed had just been opened. And for a moment, I just stood there, phone still in my hand, listening to the quiet around me, feeling my own heartbeat steady in a way it had not been in a long time. And that steadiness should have scared me, because calm usually came before something unpredictable. But this felt different. It felt earned. Like I had crossed a line I could not step back from even if I wanted to. And I was still trying to understand that when I heard movement from the other room, the subtle shift of a chair, the sound of footsteps approaching, and my body reacted instantly, tension returning before my mind could catch up, because habits like that do not disappear overnight. They stay, waiting, ready to take over the second something changes. And when he stepped into the doorway, his presence filling the space the same way it always did, I felt that familiar pressure settle in again. But this time it did not take over completely. This time there was something underneath it, something steadier, something that did not retreat. Who were you talking to? He asked, his tone controlled but sharper than before, and I met his gaze without immediately looking away. And that alone felt like a shift, small but undeniable, because usually I would have deflected, would have softened my answer before it even left my mouth. But now I paused, just long enough to choose my words instead of reacting. Someone who listened, I said quietly, and the truth of it settled between us in a way that could not be undone, and I saw it in his expression, that moment of confusion, brief but real, like he had not expected that answer, like he had expected something easier, something familiar, and that difference mattered more than anything else, because it meant the pattern had changed, even if only slightly, and for a second, neither of us moved, the air between us tightening in a different way now. Not just control, not just silence, but something uncertain, something neither of us fully understood yet. And I felt it clearly then, that quiet strength growing where fear used to sit, not replacing it completely, but standing beside it, steady and present. And I held on to that feeling as he took a step closer, not as close as before, not with the same certainty. And that alone told me everything I needed to know. Something had shifted for him too. Something he could not immediately control. You do not need anyone else, he said after a moment, his voice lower now, more measured, like he was choosing his words carefully. And I almost smiled at that, not because it was comforting, but because it was familiar, the same belief, the same expectation, and for the first time, It did not feel absolute. It felt like an opinion, and that distinction changed everything. Maybe I do, I replied, my voice steady, my hands still at my sides, no longer hiding, no longer trembling the way they had before. And the silence that followed was different again, not heavy, not suffocating, but uncertain, like the ground beneath us was no longer fixed, and I could see it in the way he watched me, not with complete control anymore, but with something closer to calculation, like he was reassessing, adjusting to something he had not anticipated. And I realized then that this was the moment, not dramatic, not loud, but significant in a way that would ripple through everything that came next. Because once you step outside the pattern, even slightly, it never fits the same way again. And as I stood there, holding onto that quiet certainty that had started to take root, I understood something I had been too afraid to see before. Control only works when both people believe in it. And for the first time, I did not. He did not respond right away, and that silence stretched longer than any before it, not because it was heavier, but because it was unfamiliar, like both of us were standing in a space that neither of us fully understood anymore. And I could see it in his eyes, that brief flicker of recalculation, the subtle shift from certainty to something more measured, and it should have made me uneasy, should have made me step back into the pattern I knew so well. But instead I stayed exactly where I was, steady, present, holding on to that quiet strength that had taken root inside me. And for the first time, I did not feel like I was waiting for something to happen. I felt like I was part of what happened next, and that realization settled deeper than anything else, because it meant I was no longer just reacting, I was choosing, and choices changed everything. You think this changes things, he said finally, his voice calm but carrying an edge I recognized, not sharp enough to cut, but enough to remind me of what he believed. And I held his gaze, not challenging, not retreating, just steady. It already has, I replied, my voice quiet but certain, and the truth of that statement hung between us, undeniable, because nothing about this felt the same anymore, not the room, not the silence, not even the way I was standing here. And I saw it again, that moment of hesitation in him. So small most people would have missed it, but I did not, because I had spent too long studying every detail, every shift, every change in tone. And this was different. This was not control. This was adjustment. And that difference mattered more than anything else, because it meant the balance had shifted, even if only slightly. And he stepped back then, just half a step, but enough to change the space between us, enough to give me room that had not been there before. And I felt it immediately, that subtle release of pressure, like something that had been holding me in place had finally loosened. And I did not move to fill the space. I let it stay, let it exist, because for once, I did not feel the need to close the distance, to smooth things over, to return everything to what it had been. And that choice felt powerful in a way I had never experienced before, because it was mine, completely mine. And as the silence settled again, I realized something else, something even more important. I was not afraid of it anymore. Not in the same way, because silence had always been something I endured, something I survived, but now it felt different. Now it felt like something I could use, something that did not belong only to him. And that shift changed everything. I am going out, I said after a moment, the words simple but carrying more weight than they should have. And his gaze sharpened slightly, the old pattern trying to reassert itself. Where? He asked, the question automatic, expected, but this time, it did not land the same way. This time it felt like a question, not a command. And I noticed that, held on to it, because it mattered. It does not matter, I replied calmly, reaching for my keys, my movements unhurried, deliberate, and I could feel his attention on me, tracking every step, every motion. But it did not stop me. It did not pull me back the way it used to. And when I reached the door, I paused for just a second, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because I understood exactly what this moment meant, that stepping outside would not just be leaving the apartment. It would be stepping fully into something new, something uncertain, something I had chosen. And that choice carried both risk and possibility in equal measure. And I turned the handle slowly, opening the door to the hallway beyond. The light there brighter, clearer, and as I stepped through, I felt it fully for the first time. That shift, that quiet but undeniable change that had been building since the moment Adrian looked at me and saw what I had tried to hide. And as the door closed behind me, I understood the truth I had been avoiding all along. The moment someone sees the truth, everything changes. But the moment you decide to act on it, nothing stays the same.